Welcome to our first Chapter 40 podcast. In this first podcast, I want to discuss just a little bit more about some basic anatomy and physiology of animals in general, but we're also going to talk a bit about humans, of course, because we're most people's favorite type of animal. So, getting into the beginning parts here, I want to make sure you guys realize what some simple terms are. Anatomy is going to be the actual structures that make up our body. So when we go over here and say this is a model of the heart, and these are ultimately going to be models of veins and arteries that are in our heart. This would be the diaphragm here that kind of separates this upper part of our body with the lungs from the lower part with that beautiful liver you can see there. That's that wonderful shade of brown. So initially the structures will be anatomy. Physiology is going to be how those structures actually function. So it's going to be more of what they do and how they do it. Not just it's brown and it's got, 3 lobes and it's got these various characteristics. And the human body itself, and pretty much all animals, can be broken down into 4 tissue types. So I want to at least briefly discuss those. We're not going to go crazy here, but just to make sure you guys understand that when you want to put together a large organism, you do it by, in a specific way, putting together these smaller pieces. So we had atoms got put together into molecules. The molecules could be put together to get big macromolecules. Those macromolecules could get put together to give us organelles and cells, and then cells get put together to give us tissues, etc. So there's this hierarchy where we get to increasing complexity as we go. And it matters what you have at those lower levels of complexity, though, that determines what you have when you get to the higher levels. Because the higher levels are comprised of these smaller pieces, and if you change those pieces, you change how it can function. You change what it looks like. You change what it can do. So epithelial tissue will be one of our tissue types, and this one will be basically like skin or coatings or coverings. So epithelial tissue, if I can pronunciate it, that's going to be like the skin that covers up our whole body. This will also surround our organs on the inside and out. So pretty much anytime you need a lining that's going to produce mucus or secrete stuff or just provide a layer of protection that kind of says this is out and this is in. It could be this is outside the liver, this is inside the liver. Could be this is outside my body, this is inside my body. Pretty much any of those things will be considered epithelial. Now, when we look at epithelial tissue, I don't know why I keep saying it because I say it poorly, we're going to look at the layers and the shapes, because some of our stuff will be what's called simple, and that typically just means that we have one layer, and then we'll see that we also can have what was called stratified. And so stratified just means that there's 2 or more layers. So simple stuff is great if you want to have transfer occur, because you have just one sheet, so it's not very long of a distance for something to diffuse across. If you're talking about something serving more of a metabolic function, or in many cases if it's serving like a physical protective function, like a callus on your skin, you want to have a lot of layers because that prevents damage. So stratified's favored more in those areas like our actual skin, where it's there for durability. We don't want it to be one single layer where you get tapped hard enough and suddenly you've got a gap and bacteria can get inside and mess with you. The other way is you'll see we do it based on shape, and so they can be cuboidal, which is like a box. They can be columnar, which is long and skinny like a column. And they can also be squamous, which is what I always consider like a egg. If you think of like a egg that you just kind of put down, you bust it open and just let it sit there, or like a pancake. And each of these, which we're not going to get into much about this, I just want you to realize there's different functions and different shapes and different structures, that whole structure and function, anatomy and physiology, if you will. But I want you to realize each of them suits specific needs. So for instance, squamous is really good because it has a high surface area for coverings like our skin cells. Whereas if you've got something like cuboidal, that does very well if you're trying to do like transport across. Whereas columnar would do well if you're trying to do like metabolism, because it's got more room, more cytoplasm to have enzymes to do these metabolic functions. So that's just a quick intro there. The next one, connective tissue. So this normally holds stuff together, not too crazy of a definition. And this is oftentimes can be made of like this interweaving amount of fiber. You'll see collagen's a common one, and elastin is less common but important. So collagen is what holds a lot of stuff together, like our skin in place. Elastin is what gives it elasticity, so you can move your face and it won't stick that way, contrary to what you may have been told. But we have lots of connective tissue in our body. We have fat, or adipose tissue as they call it. We have blood plasma, which contains and kind of keeps everything, well, together and in place within our blood, all the red blood cells, the white blood cells, platelets, proteins. We have bone and cartilage. Those ones I think most people are fairly comfortable with. And then we've got things like tendons and ligaments that hold muscle to bone. You'll see like this would be a tendon. And you've got ligaments that hold bone to bone, so that would be a ligament. Cartilage tends to be in the middle here, acting as kind of a buffer to make sure you're not grinding bone on bone. And then we obviously have bone itself. So this is just a knee showing that we've got lots of these different types of connective tissue just in this one place, all working together. So connective tissue helps keep things where they're supposed to be. You've got like mesenteries or connective tissue that when we do dissection, you'll see that they hold the organs in place. So they'll be like these stringy spider web type things that hold everything there, so you don't like shake around and suddenly your kidneys floating on up and trying to visit your lung. It keeps everything where it's supposed to be. Now, nervous tissue, this is going to be all about sending things from one part of the body to another quickly. So it's going to allow signals to travel so you can say, oh yeah, pain, or that smells nice, or that ball's about to hit me in the face as you see it coming towards you. And that's going to function by having a bunch of these neurons, which are just nerve cells hooked up together. So right now you've got this end is kind of the receiving end. It's called the dendrite. All right, and these little pieces here can receive a stimulus from the environment or from another neuron. And then you've got the cell body is kind of where the organelles and the nucleus and such are. That's, I guess you'd say, like the body, imagine that, of the neuron. That's the nucleus right there. And then you have this long, thin part that's called the axon that's there to kind of rapidly transmit this signal. So we get the signal over here at the dendrite, and then we will transmit it all the way through to the end of the axons, axon terminals, whatever you want, axon hillock, whatever you want to call it. But basically the end of the axon, and then it can jump across to another neuron's dendrites and continue its progress. So we'll get way more in depth with nervous tissue later, because there's the nervous system that we have that pretty much does a lot in our body. So we'll get way more in depth with that. But for now, just understand this is one of the types of tissue we have. And the nervous cells, these neurons, ultimately penetrate pretty much all of our organs so that they can receive signals and send signals based upon what's going on, even if we're not aware of them. Now, muscle tissue. Muscle is all about contracting. That's all it can really do. And so contraction is where it's going to shrink, essentially. So it shortens the distance, which pulls. And so that's how your arms work, is you're pulling this upper muscle. I'd show you if you could see it. But it's the bicep, and so when I shorten that bicep, it's going to pull my arm up because it's attached to the bone down here. Now, they can only go in one direction. So you have another muscle, your tricep, that's on the bottom here, and that one can tug, and it tugs on the other part of this, which makes it go the opposite way. So muscles will always exist in these antagonistic pairs for movement because they can only technically make you move in one direction. You need another set of muscles to make the other direction work. So I can go up and down. That's bicep and tricep. And so this will work with all of our stuff. And you don't have to memorize muscles, but just understand they can contract in one direction. That's what they do. That's all they do. The skeletal muscles, these are the ones that you'll see that we use for normal motion that we can control. This is typically for movement. That's what looks like these guys up here. They've got these striations, these lines that let you know that's what it is. You've got smooth muscle. This is the ones that don't look striated. These ones tend to do jobs that are, I'll say, low stress. They're not like fast jobs, but they're ones that you don't want to get tired with. So this is like your digestive system. It's not like your digestive system's running, but you need it to consistently work. So it's smooth muscle. Some birds and such that stand around a lot will have some smooth muscle in their legs that just keeps them standing. When they want to run, they're going to need skeletal muscles because those ones tend to be much faster, more powerful, but they also get tired quicker. So your skeletal muscle lets you run, but simple standing can be smooth muscle. And then cardiac muscle is kind of like a modified striated stuff. It's kind of like modified skeletal. You can see the striations, but it also has these connections electrically, which allows for electrical signals to transfer well through them, which is useful in our heart because an electrical signal is what makes it beat. And so we'll discuss that a bit more later on, but ultimately just understand that cardiac is technically a slightly different type where it's a little bit more electrically special, but otherwise it's fairly similar to skeletal muscle. Not perfect, but that's good enough for our definition right now. Now, in our bodies, we have at least two major cavities that we typically talk about. You have the thoracic cavity, which is the upper one, so that's the one up here. That contains your lungs and your heart. And then you have a diaphragm that's going to separate these two. So that's going to be a muscle that will change the size of your thoracic cavity. So that way it kind of smushes your lungs and makes you breathe out. Or it pulls down and expands it, which makes you breathe in. And then below that, we've got the abdominal cavity. And so that's going to have the liver up here on top, and then all of your digestive organs, your intestines, your stomach, they're all going to be all through here. You've got your kidneys would be kind of in the back here, your bladder, then ultimately you get down to the genitalia towards the bottom. So that all is going to be our abdominal cavity. And so these are just large, I'll say open areas for now because they're fluid filled, and they would be open if you took all the organs out, but it's these large fluid filled areas that have the organs kind of just in there, floating around and attached via mesentery. But just keep in mind, it's not like we're all contiguous. Even our insides are compartmented. And as we said, the diaphragm will just be the dividing piece. I don't know why I went through it, but we'll deal with that. And then the last bit for this first podcast before we get into some of the basics of regulation is just a brief intro on organ systems. I want you guys to make sure you're comfortable with this idea that if we take similar cells with a similar function and put them together, we can get tissues. And if I take these tissues and put them together in specific ways, I can get organs. But even organs can be put together into these organ systems. And after this chapter, most of our chapters are going to revolve around an organ system. So just some of the basics. We won't cover all these in that much detail, so I feel like it's at least useful to mention them. Digestive system, which will be around two things. First of all, it's going to be digestion or breaking down our food. So that's its first part, if you will, breaking down the food. But then also it has to absorb it, because we have to get that food into our blood so we can actually use it. Otherwise, the food just goes through our digestive system, out the other end, and we didn't really gain anything from it. So that'll be our digestive system, and that has a bunch of organs that are part of it, that the food travels through, and then there'll also be organs that help. So don't assume, like, to be a digestive organ, you don't have to have food pass through you. There's things like the pancreas and the liver that produce things like enzymes or proteins that are used to break down food, even though the food never actually touches that organ. That's perfectly fine. It's still part of there. Circulatory system, usually lumped with the respiratory as well. So those two are kind of paired. Circulatory system is going to obviously move our blood around our body, and then the respiratory system that's normally paired with it will also do gas exchange. So this is largely to make sure that we can get oxygen and nutrients to our cells and CO2 and waste away from our cells and out of our body. Excretory system is ultimately going to be the one that's going to produce urine. So I know you might think excretion, you might think defecation, that's digestive. But if you're talking about urination, which is pretty much just filtering the blood, I mean, that's when we talk about excretory, that's what your kidneys are part of. And that's what your kidneys do, is they filter out all the wastes and such that were dumped into your blood by your cells. It's their job to filter it out and get it the heck out of the body. So excretory system is going to be pretty much your bladder, your kidneys, things like that. And then endocrine system, this is going to be, and we will go into this is our hormonal system. So this is the stuff that we produce that are signals within our body that get sent around to help us control our own body. And then reproductive, I hope you're aware of your reproductive system. I hope you really haven't used it too much yet, but the reproductive system is going to be the one that's going to be in charge of reproduction. So this is going to be how you can make children. Obviously, it will differ from males and females, but when we talk about the reproductive system, which we will get to, we're pretty much just going to talk about how those parts work to produce the gametes, and ultimately for females, how the process of pregnancy through labor works. Otherwise, that's all I have for right now. We're going to pick up with a lot more regulation, thermal regulation, and a bit of osmoregulation with the next podcast. But I wanted to make sure you guys at least got some overview of just the generalities of animals and specifically human bodies in general before we got too much into that. I will say that a lot of this stuff is not going to be covered in any depth on the AP exam most likely, but I think this is useful in general, so deal with it. Take it easy.